the challenge that I'm trying to face these days, and it's slightly different from things that usually attempted in the academic world for one reason, which is since I became a professor, I discovered that I now have a few perks, and one of them is I can do research on whatever I want, and including things that I would always recommend that my PhD students steer away from, like this one, because it's a very complex problem and it's not something that will be easy to finish and easy to discover and then easy to publish. And so you'll have to excuse me, because I'll be presenting the big problem and 3 different attempts I've made to tackle different parts of it. And I think they all show the interest of the problem and the difficulty as well. And none of them is really finished. It's all ongoing work, but I thought this kind of seminar might be a good place to present work of this kind. So thank you very much, Ignatius, for having me, and let's see if I can get through all of this in 45 minutes. Okay, so the reason why I started doing this, as Ignatius was saying, I've been working on computational models of literary creativity, and that boils down to programs that attempt to create in some way things that might look like literary works. That's poetry, stories, anything like that. And I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, and I've discovered a lot of things, most of them related to how not to do it. I've tried lots of different technologies, lots of different AI techniques. I've tried different genres, and none of them has been very successful. And I wondered why. And at some point, as I was reflecting, maybe I'm doing this wrong. Maybe some of the assumptions that I started from are incorrect. So I started looking at a little more closely at the examples of the things that I wanted to create, and then I realized that maybe I was assuming that these stories, you'll have this idea that they're linear. There's a linear sequence of events, and it's only creating a story is only about finding the right events and putting them in the right order. And so I started looking at actual examples of stories, not terribly complex one either. And then I discovered that even the simplest stories I could start from were significantly more complex than the representation I was trying to use to build them. And that, of course, I thought that might explain a lot of what had been happening to me, because good stories are not flat in the least, and this happens at different levels for different reasons. And one of them, not necessarily the only one, is that they sometimes include embedded stories. So that's why I started working on this. This is just a small sketch of the things I wanted to tell you. And this is where I wanted to show you that this is really a problem in 3 parts, or at least I have identified 3 different parts to this problem. One is, how do you identify from text this is an embedded discourse? This is something that is a discourse in itself that appears in the context of a larger discourse. Then if you had that solved, then it's a different problem, which is how do you represent this? And because it's not necessarily just one level and one embedding in it. It's recursive, and it can go down quite deep. So how do you represent this, and how do you deal with these different narrative levels when you are interpreting a discourse for a particular story? Obviously, in short stories, this is tends to be less complex, but we want a representation that can also encompass novels, for instance, and they do have a lot of this, and they rely a lot of this in creating some of the effects that the authors achieve. So it's an interesting thing to have a handle on. But then, of course, even if you have all these stories don't necessarily refer to the same story world. They sometimes refer to other worlds. They sometimes refer to conflicting views on the same world, or things that happened before, things that will happen later. And how do you deal with this when you're trying to interpret it? You no longer have a single story, a single narrative for the truth. You're dealing with fiction. Fiction usually involves different opposing views on most things and how they're built together and how the author builds contrast between them. And sometimes also just you'll see the interesting thing is not just the view at the end, but how many different views and how many contrasts between the views the author managed to create along the line of the discourse that he's created. Okay, so there's three problems that we want to look at. And as I say, been working on each of them. This is not what one would do. One would usually try to first get one solved and then move on to the different one. But I found that it wasn't terribly obvious how to solve the initial one without knowing how the second one went, because the one is feeding into the other and so on. So I'll give you rather breadth first approach to this problem, and I'm aware that there's still a lot of depth to be explored in all three of these different points. Okay, so embedded stories, just the basics. I don't want to bore you, but this is basically when you're reading a story, the characters in the story start telling stories themselves. And then this character tells a story to the other character, and then it can go on. And you'll see, I'll show you some examples of this. So this is what they call an embedded story. The story being told by the characters is the embedded story. The story in which the characters are telling a story is the frame story. And each of these levels of nesting is called a narrative level. The classic example of this is the Arabian Nights. We all know the story, but I'll go through it in a short version just so that we all know where we stand. This is the tale of this king, and the king has some kind of misadventure with his wife and goes on a revenge spree and decides that every night he's going to marry a new girl and then kill her in the morning. And then the heroine of the story comes up. This is Scheherazade, and she's read lots of stories. She knows lots of stories, and she goes to her father and says, I'm going to marry this king, and I'm going to save all these other girls from being killed. And the interesting thing is that right at this point, when she says this to her father comes back and says, no, you have to be careful. I'm going to tell you a story so that you understand what's happening. And this sets the trend for the rest of the book, which is, you can see there's in blue on the side, there's the frame story for the whole thing. There's the first story in the book, and it's not even one of that told by Scheherazade, it's just her father. And then this one closes off, and we go back to the story of Scheherazade and says, yes, let's organize this. So they go on, and at some point, Scheherazade is with the king and she starts telling stories. Okay, and this is the first story that Scheherazade tells, and she starts telling the story. And inside that story, at some point, one of the characters says, I'm going to tell you a story. So this is already 3 levels deep at this point. And the interesting thing is, this is the whole trick of the book. Shehrazade's trick is at dawn, when she ought to be killed, because that's what the king's been doing with every other girl, she stops and she has not 1 but 2 stories unfinished. And then the king says, okay, I'll put it off for one night, and you can finish this for one day. You can finish the story on the next night. Anyway, this goes on. I don't really know if it's 1001, but that's just the title. But there's lots. Scheherazade tells lots of stories in the book, and a lot of them have nested stories in them. Actually, some of them quite go. Well, the nesting goes quite deep. Anyway, in this situation, what you're having is someone telling a story to someone else about characters that are usually, in this case, it's not necessarily what happens always, but in this case, they're usually characters in a different setting. Okay, and it goes quite deep, as I say. This is the kind of representation. We're no longer trying to represent a linear sequence of events. It is a story. We need this nesting with one story inside the other. And sometimes these stories do have references to the stories in which they're being told. And that's another thing we need to deal with. Okay, so to model this kind of interpretation, what we need is when you're processing a discourse and suddenly discover, hey, an embedded story is starting here and it ends here, and then you need to know what to do with it, how to represent this the embedded story, how to represent the fact that that occurs in the frame story, and then how to handle the semantics of relations between these things. Okay, so the embedded stories are an instance of embedded discourse. And what happens with embedded discourse is quite interesting as well. It's a different phenomenon. The semantics of this is interesting. So here I have on the left, this is meant to represent what is actually happening, what we're talking about. And on the right, it's how we represent what is happening, what we know about, what we're learning about what is happening. So if in the past, this black man was fighting, this we will represent, just for the sake of argument, like this. But at this point, he tells someone else that he's been fighting, then we also represent that. That's no problem. Now, the thing is, when he's telling someone about the fact that he's been fighting in the past, this is actually a reference. It's a reference to some part of the story that's already happened. So this is kind of anaphoric discourse. It's not the only case, because rather like anaphora in general, when we're only told that he's telling someone that he's been fighting, there's this presumption of truth. So we usually infer that he had been fighting in the past. And that's something that would need to be represented as well in this interpretation mechanism. But if the fight in the past did not happen as he's telling it, then we have a different situation. This is not anaphoric discourse, deceptive discourse. It's trying to convey to this lady here in the picture a view of the past that is not true. And then again, we would need to have means of representing this, these conflicting views on the past. Then, in a similar situation, if he's telling this, if we are actually being told the story, and the story includes an earlier span where we are told about the truth about what he was doing in the past, and then we hear him, we're told that he's telling someone else a deceptive version of this, then we know it's a conflicting discourse, and we need to have the means for representing these two conflicting views on the situation. Okay, this is yet a fourth alternative that also needs to be represented, which is when he's just telling someone about his plans, his wishes, or something like that. And then this he is describing a set of events that is not part of the story world. Hasn't really happened in the story world at that point, but he is just referring to this possible world, and we might need also some way of dealing with that. At least at this point, I mean, at the point I'm working on, what I need is to just identify those, to just leave them out for the time being, because I'm not trying to represent this modal story worlds yet. They might need to be added later. Okay, so to study this set of phonomena, what I'm looking at is this corpus, and I started with the morphology of the set of tales, analyzed the morphology of the folktale by Vladimir Prop, which is a classic. It's based on an anthology of Russian folk tales, and I'm working not from the tales themselves, but from the analysis that Prop makes of them in his book. So there's this short synopsis transcribed into clean text in one case, but also transcribed into, you'll see, a conceptual representation to allow me to try to handle the interpretation of the discourse. This is an example of the tale, and I've marked for purposes of the natural language processing side. I hand annotated some of these embedded discourses. Some interesting cases here where the embedded set of events is not referred in as a sentence that describes the event, but as a single name that describes whatever happened. I also had a different one, which is the fairy tales of Madame d'Aulnoy, who invented the term fairy tale, in fact. And again, I'm not using the original fairy tales, but the annotated version of them. Elizabeth Williams, in her PhD thesis, annotated a set of these tales with props, character functions, which is the structure for the narrative that I'm using to identify parallelisms. Okay, and again, I mark these and then to give me some gold standard to check my natural language processing solutions on. Okay, so just some, I'll rush through this if anybody's interested there in the papers, which I'll give you the pointers to at the end. But this is just the statistics on the number of embeddings and the number of nestings. It's around 16% of the total text that is actually embedded in a story and is consistent across the two subcorpora that I'm using. To try and go a little further, we're also using a corpus of opera libretti of 18th century opera, and I'll just mention it here because I'll be showing you some examples from them later. This one in particular, it's, stories of the Persian kings, stories of murder and deception in the Persian court. Okay, so to identify the embedded discourse, this is a very basic attempt just to make sure this could be done. It clearly needs a lot more work, but I was using Core NLP, and basically it's just constituency parsers. And what I need to do is, in this kind of sentence, Nightingale foretells the son will humiliate the parents, I need to be able to isolate the clause that refers to the prophecy from the main clause that mentions that it's happening. Okay, and I need to find a way of basically keeping track of these, because I need to be able in the text to identify where one part stops and where the other one begins. There's a number of other different constructions that also need to be handled. This is basically a tree rewriting approach that identifies from the original set of syntax trees in the text a number of simpler trees, and then uses the information from those to segment the text. So the segmenting is based on basically whether there is subclauses. That is a hint that there's embedding going on. Particular verbs always suggest that there's an embedding going on. The use of quotation marks is also a very significant tool at the surface of the text to indicate embedding. The ends are much more difficult to find. Obviously, if we've simplified, we've broken up the big syntax trees into simpler syntax trees. If one of these starts an embedded discourse, it will not, it can't close there, because it will need to at least follow on to the sub clause before closing. Then another issue is things like this, where this is a prophecy, all the prophecies in the future. When we come back from the future to the present, that's clearly a good surface marker of when the embedding has ended. And obviously quotation marks, closing quotation marks at the end also indicate this, and then they usually also marked by the tense. So with this basic heuristics, I can over my hand annotated gold standard, I get basically these are the results. Again, you're welcome to check the paper if you're interested. Basically, they show good precision and not so good recall. I think that's because the features I'm using are good indicators, but I'm probably missing other indicators that would raise the recall numbers a bit. Anyway, that's just the same thing. Now, if I had a solution working for this, which I don't, but if I had it, what would I need to produce so I can actually start considering representation of the recursive nesting that is involved? So what I've done is I've just come up with a simple predicate argument structure with a few extras to notate start and end of an embedded story, and then I'm going to propose some data structures that would deal with this kind of behavior. Obviously, if I had the first part of the problem solved, it should produce a transcription of the story in this kind of notation. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that I'm looking at. These are actually hand built by me from the synopsis of the tales that I'm in my corpus. So there's a start of story marker, there's the sequence of statement for the story, and then an end of story marker that also includes information about who's telling the story, who it's being told to, and there's a ID for the story that allows to keep track of them. From that kind of notation, I can build an interpretation of this kind of story, and obviously it must hold this sequence of statements, but also it has this index structure of any embedded stories that might appear within it. And this is indexed by the name of the story, so you can actually reconstruct from this kind of structure the discourse, the linear sequential discourse that it came from, just by following the sequence and it reinserting some of these stories wherever they're referred to by their story ID. This is what you're getting on the left, the discourse, and as the story unfolds, there might be different narrative levels, and each of them gets a new column to the right. In this case, the hero is told that a dragon had kidnapped a princess. So this is a story you can see in narrative level 1. This is being told to the hero, and then he decides to react based on having heard that story. So we get this nesting of stories, and this is what I'm going to represent. Okay, as you follow a story and the sequence of a story, you need to be able to identify these things and build them up. Okay, this is just the actual pseudocode for the procedure on the left, but I'll try to animate it for you. So basically, you're building this interpretation which has room for embedded stories represented within it, but you also keep a stack of the context in which you're working. So when you get a new sentence, you add it to the interpretation. Next sentence, if you're still in the frame story, gets added to the same interpretation. If at this point you get a start of story marker, you shift the whole interpretation you had to the stack and you create a new one for the embedded story. Now, subsequent events in that embedded story get added to the embedded story. When you reach the end of story marker, you basically put aside the interpretation you've already built for the embedded story, retrieve from the stack the context in which this happens. You add the embedded story to the interpretation of the frame story in your context, and then you add to the frame story the sentence that says, and this character told the story to this other character, told this story to this other character. So this is how the machinery works. You can see it here in for an example, this is also a classic example of the Russian folk tales analyzed by Prop, which involve this false hero sequence where the hero does something, then someone comes and claims that it wasn't the hero, it was them, and then the story evolves and eventually the false hero gets found out. So you get the frame story, and then this is the one where the hero is motivated by hearing that the princess has been kidnapped, and then decides to react, fights the dragon, releases the princess, but gets lost on the way back. And then a water carrier arrives first and claims that he saved the princess, but they had then the hero arrives and the princess recognizes him and the water carrier is exposed. So you're getting this. In fact, you're getting the same span of story. The actual rescue of the princess is told 3 times in this story, right? One when we're told that the hero did it, then once when the water carrier claims he did it, and then once when the princess explains that it was really the hero. So this is a kind of situation that we need to deal with. Okay. So this is the same thing. You can see where it gets told the story of the kidnapping, and then you can see that because you can see the kind of representation that I have in these little stories and how they relate to the machinery underneath, the interpretation machinery underneath. Okay. If you try to run this on something big, like this story of murder and deception in the Persian court, it's interesting to see both how relevant it is, all these mechanisms are, and how they actually turn out to be a fundamental part of the storytelling tradition of this kind of opera, right? In this particular case, this Artabano, this guy comes in with bloodied hands and tells that he's just killed the king and explains that his plan is that for his son to become king. So he goes somewhere else and tells that the son of the king killed the king. And this story gets spread out by other characters to other characters. And then because of this, the son of the king gets killed as well for killing his father. But then someone discovers that it hadn't been the son of the king who killed the king. And then they start building this deception. But the interesting thing about this is that you can see here on the left column on each side is what's actually happening on stage. And that's really nothing. It's all just people talking to one another. And anything that involves actual action only happens in the stories that are being told by the people who are on stage. And in fact, at every scene, there's only the initial situation before each scene change has no stories. All the others, for each scene, there's a story being told that pushes the story forward. So this is actually the main mechanism for storytelling in this particular context. I think it had to do with the fact that at that time they couldn't have very good stage machinery or special effects or anything. So all the serious action was just someone saying that had happened. Okay, so this is has lots of limitations. This is also ongoing work, and it's just the first approach. It's assuming that each of these embedded stories is a single span. This is not usually the case. We've seen it in the Arabian Nights. They stop one and go into another one and then come back and come back out and then come back in. And this would not be able to deal with that yet. It would need to be extended, but I think it can be done. This is based on the synopsis rather than the full text. So there's issues with the linguistic machinery used to represent these things that we saw a little bit of at the beginning, but which are not addressed at this stage or at this level of representation. And also at this particular point, we are assuming that it's all in chronological order, which we know is not usually the case. So that again would need to be extended. Okay, so again, I should have waited until I had all that second level of challenges solved, but I didn't. I moved on and then tried to work out what might be needed if that were solved. What happens is I'm getting this this is another story also represented in the same notation, and in this case it's the same thing. The wild mare destroys the wheat fields. A peasant tells the hero that the wild mare has destroyed the wheat fields. He decides to react, and then we're using the same notation here. This is another specific notation added to deal with the modals. In this case, the hero orders a cell to be made. So this is slightly different from the embedded stories, but it's again a set of events that is packaged into the direct object of a particular sentence in the story. So we add this argument to indicate what type of modality is being used. Okay, now when we have this kind of thing and we know that these discourse might be giving us conflicting views of particular sets of events in the story, like we've seen for the water carrier and the hero and the rescue of the princess, and so we need to be able to have these separate representations when they occur. We need to be aware that there's two alternative views in a particular set of events, and then there's just one at the beginning, and then there's two, and then when the false hero is exposed, one of them is sort of cancelled out, and then we end up with just one. So this kind of dynamics also needs to be modeled in some way. So I'm not going to try to explain the underlying logic, just to show you that, I mean, there is one, there's this working system that does this. But so here what I'm showing you is on the left is the actual discourse as it's happening. On the right, you have the story that is being built. When alternatives appear, they are being added in the right-hand column for this. And underneath, I just have a representation of the alternative views. You'll see they'll be coming up, and each row is a different alternative view on the truth of the story world as being told by someone at some point. So the brother sets out, this is actually the same story. He gets told about the abduction of the princess, and the abduction of the princess, we know because of the way it's told, that happened before the start of the story. So it needs to be shifted up. You can see here on the right-hand column, the corresponding story has been added in the chronological order of the fabula, not the discourse, before everything else. Okay, sorry for the shifts in scale, but this is brother fights the dragon, but then this other guy comes and tells that he's one did the fighting. So you can see down here, there's two different views on the truth. Both share the same events from 1 to 4 and 8 to 10, but 5, 6, 7, 0, 1, 2 is referred to different events from the different views of the story at that point. And then story goes on. Princess recognizes the brother. False hero is exposed. The story is now labeled as false. The story that the false hero told is now labeled as false. So at this stage, we're back to only a single possible interpretation of the truth of the story. Okay. Now the interesting thing here is you can see this is the way things evolve, and up to time 9, there's a single view. Okay. No, sorry, you can see it here. And then for up to time 3, the single view. At this point, to time 4, and then here you get 2 different views, and then in stage 14, because one of them is cancelled out because we now know it's false, then we go back to 1. Now this is interesting because if you actually plot the number of alternative conflicting views on the truth through the story as the discourse goes along, what you're getting is this kind of graph. There's 1 at the beginning, then 2, then 1, and this is sort of, this aligns with this classic view of the stories as a rising action and then falling action. There's a tension in the middle because you have 2 conflicting truths, and you don't know which one is the truth, or you don't know which one will end up being recognized as the truth, because this is likely to end up badly for either the hero or the false hero. So this is what happens. This is some numbers of the different types of stories for the set of folk tales in the prop corpus. As you can see here, it's on the left, you can see some of them. These are the ones that get told inside the story, but that refer to just adding background to the actual story. Anaphoric are stories that are actually where one character in the story is telling another character of something that has already been told by the narrator to the reader. The false ones are the deceiving discourse, and the models are prophecies, plans, intentions, wishes, whatever. The machinery that we have is quite good at detecting things. Some of them don't work so well, because I was assuming that my representation would, when referring to a story, will always reproduce it in full, and it doesn't. When the stories are being told, they're summarized versions of whatever the narrator told at the beginning, and the system fails to recognize them in this case. That's why I'm getting strange numbers there. Anyway, if we run this kind of thing over the Artaserse libretto, or the libretto for Artaserse opera, where there's it's interesting because it basically the plot basically is fueled by different people being accused of having killed the king, and then it's interesting how you can plot this graph of alternatives and ups and downs of the story based on this relatively simple machinery. Okay, so I'm not doing too bad in terms of time. Good. I wish I could have lots of impressive conclusions, but I don't, mainly because it's, as I say, everything is ongoing. It's a set of pieces, and none of the pieces is finished, and they're not actually terribly well connected. But I think the big picture is there. There's this, this is the problem. This is a problem that is, all these different things are connected in the context of this big problem related to the interpretation and narrative. I think it's a problem that's worth solving. And well, Ignatius mentioned that I've been working on this for a long time, long before GPT and all that. And I've tried a lot of different techniques. I moved on. I've done case-based reasoning. I've done evolutionary solutions. I've done rule-based. I've done statistical models. I've done agent systems. I've done lots of things, and each one of them has some features that are good for part of the problem, and they all generate. Generating is easy. Generating stories, generating poems is reasonably easy, but so for all of those, I would always get to the point where I could press a button and get 100 stories, and that's not terribly difficult. The problem I've always found was how to tell out of the 100 stories which ones were worth looking at, because not all of them were. And I think that's, at this point, I think that ChatGPT is generating very good stories. I don't think there's much point anymore in spending a lot of effort in trying to generate stories in different, using different technologies, at least not stories that might compete with those. So I think the problem has shifted to this other challenge, which is how do you tell out of the hundreds of stories that any of these technologies can build, which are the good ones. And that is basically what all this is about. This is, I think, that one of a very relevant aspect in our own procedures for deciding a story is better than another is this kind of complexity, this kind of rich fabric of conflicting storylines and this interesting evolution of the sets of conflicting storylines that is built as the discourse goes along, and that's what I'm trying to work on now for the future. In practical terms, yes, open problem still needs a lot of work, I'm aware. It was interesting for me to discover that embedded stories actually are a fundamental tool for presenting stories out of parts of the story out of the chronological order, for flashbacks and flash forwards. And the model that I'm describing captures the nested structure. It has the stack mechanism to keep track of the context and bring back the right context at each time for the next step of interpretation. The stories are embedded in an index table, so each of the stories you're getting an access to its representation, but you also via the index you can place it in the right context. It also has at least an initial heuristic to identifying the plausible order. This story goes up here, this one is actually in here, this one is an alternative to this other one, and that's actually solved computationally reasonably well. And it allows to have this representation of how many conflicting views are available at each point in the story, and it captures the dynamics of this. So you don't only get a picture of, hey, this story was good, this story was bad, but at this point of the story, halfway through, when the hero has rescued the princess, but it's the false hero who's getting all the recognition, what is the feeling that the reader is getting at that point, and how that changes over the sequence of the story. Okay, so that I think all of these are useful. They still need a lot of work, but I think it's a good thing. And this is just a first approximation. So I do have plenty of ideas for future work that might be done on this. I just mentioned a few here because they are pretty obvious. There's plenty more, really. It's and maybe an interesting one is this one at the end, because here I've just been focusing on the different views of the story that the reader is building in his mind. But you may, I don't know, you may have noticed, but when we're talking about the story of the murder of the Persian king, the same story gets told a few times because there's two characters on stage, one tells the other, then that one goes away, someone comes back on stage, and the same story is told, so the other characters know. And at each point of the story, different characters have actually a different picture of what really happened. And some of those are actually used by the author to create tensions and to drive the plot along a different axis, really. So that's also a really interesting avenue to explore. So all this is, you can find it published and with more detail on the papers I have here. They're all available from my webpage and on our group's website if you're interested, or even if you Google for the titles, you probably get them anyway. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Thank you very, very much. That was really, really interesting. I didn't even know we have only about 10 minutes left. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pablo. Are there questions? You're free to raise your hand if you have any question or drop a question in chat. While people are thinking of what to ask, I guess one of the things that came to mind is I understand the point about where GPT is now with regards to generating stories. But have you tried to find out how you might leverage that even in identifying, well, I'm talking from an NLP perspective, where we're thinking about how to empirically design the task as an NLP task and evaluate it as well. Is there a way you think that these large language models can help with maybe identifying these structures and embeddings in narratives or stories?
This work that's been done on using neural models for segmentation. It's and I want to look at those as well as possible additions to this toolkit. I mean, clearly it's a big problem with lots of subtasks, really, and I do think some of those subtasks might benefit from neural solutions.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether it would be specifically large language models, but yes, given the power that they've been showing, I think it'd be definitely a good thing to consider. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, Scott. Hi, Scott.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, great talk, really interesting. So one question is, you with your current method, you use a lot of discourse markers there. I think trying to find the beginning end of the segments. So one challenge I think may be the genres. Do they present any particular challenge for this, like different types of story genres? Because if they use the similar discourse markers, that should be okay. But I'm just interested to know, yeah, have you met, do you think this is the different genres can cause more challenge or less challenge?
Well, because we've only used really two different genres at this stage, but we made sure that the corpus had a reasonable variation. So we have fairy tales and librettos for operas. So there's a clear difference there because fairy tales are just text, and you need to actually look for those markers in the text to know when someone's telling a story or not. But the libretto comes as the script for a play, so you're getting each speaker and it says this, and then this speaker says this, and then speaker says this. So it's explicitly marked who is saying what. So you would think it's oh well, it's a completely different kettle of fish, but then it isn't, because even within that, you're saying this one walks on and says all this, but what he's saying is, I have gone and killed the king. So you still need in there to the actual text, even though that is marked by the speaker and you can see what he's saying, and that's one level of embedding already. But then there might be additional embeddings that come from the language side, and you still need to look out for the markers and identify those as well. And as I say, we also did some work looking at the same thing in a novel. I mean, the Arabian Nights, for instance, is very, very explicit. It's a different genre, and it is very, very explicit. And now I'm going to tell you the tale of so and so, and this title, the tale of so and so, and this ends the tale of so and so, and so there's clearly, yes, the answer is yes. Each genre does it differently. We also looked at The Heart of Darkness, the novel by Joseph Conrad, which is, again, it's three sea captains sitting in a boat by the Thames, and one of them starts telling a story of a trip up the River Congo, and and there it's just quotation marks. So you're getting some part of the story has no quotation marks, some of it has just one set of quotation marks, and then when people talk within that one, they have two sets of quotation marks. So yes, different genres have different features that you need to look out for, and obviously a full solution to the problem would need to be able to account for all of them and the combinations between them.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
So even for machine learning method you mentioned just now, I think still that also can be affected by this genre in different styles. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Any other question, comment? Okay. Okay, Paul.
Thanks, Ignatius. Yeah, thanks, Pablo. That was really interesting talk, and you've set yourself a really difficult challenge, I feel, tackling this problem. So, I mean, kind of similar to Scott's question and coming back to what you said at the start about the level of difficulty of the task. You know, have you asked 10 random people to replicate this kind of, not even the same markup, but just identifying where the switch from one story to the embedded story and back? And do people agree? And do native speakers and non-native speakers agree on that to a certain level of accuracy?
No, I haven't. But I guess I say it's one of the things that I do have in my to-do list, because this was just a rough solution to try and get some ideas going and see how it all fit together. My conclusion is that it does fit together and it is worth exploring, and then I'll start doing a little more thorough work on that kind of thing. Another point that relates to both of these questions is that I've also found that some of these things are not universal. Some of these markers are not universal in the sense that because we have the fairy tales are in English and the libretti are in Italian, and they don't use the same quotation marks the same way, or the markers for reported speech or direct speech, they're not the same. So it's again an extra level might need to be addressed.
Yeah. Oh, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Is there any other question? Okay. So once again, I thank you very much, Professor Pablo, for joining us today. I need to stop the recording before I make the final announcement. Yeah. All right. Let's stop the transcript. All right.